So, welcome back to Silmarillion Total War and to another battle replay. Been a while since we've seen Silmarillion, and I think I will be pushing this replay to be just in front of the three-part episodic series in Reforged, just because it's been quite a while since we last saw a Silmarillion replay, and also with significant updates. While I may have lost the ability to do the 5 battle replays I was sent while I was away for a works trip, the upshot of that is, the silver lining is, the reason that those replays are not available and the version of the game that was run on was no longer available is because the big updates include a couple of new factions, one of which we will be seeing on display today. Not both of them, but we will get to see at least the one in this 3v3 battle on a rather intricate looking map as well. Plenty of open terrain, rather flat as well, so you can't really rely on pitching your tent on a hill. There's a few terrain features, but for the most part the features on the map are structural, so it's going to be a little bit more about what cover you can take and what terrain you fight in as well. Terrain bonus is going to be a factor here also. Plenty of little wooded areas, plenty of opportunities to hide and ambush, which is going to be important for more than one faction on the field today, it must be said. So yeah, I think we'll be seeing this one sooner rather than later. I'd rather not be waiting a couple of weeks to get this one out, because there is going to be a tournament happening soon. I think by the time this replay comes out, that tournament will have already happened, regardless of how fast I am in getting this one out. But hopefully you were able to catch that if that is the case, and hopefully this is just reinforcing some of the new things that are going to be in Silmarillion moving forward. I don't believe there's going to be any major patches for at least a couple of months now. I think with all the fine-tuning that was done for the tournament, the 2 factions that were added, that's going to be tiding people over in terms of Silmarillion for the time being. But yes, it was Lord of Belagost who sent this battle replay to me, so big thank you to him. It's not going to be from his perspective that we see the battle from, though. I believe it is going to be J-Monster who we're going to be seeing it from. However, we will start off with one of his teammates on the purple team, which is kind of strange. I'm not sure how they've, or why even, they've changed the colour of that. It puts me in mind actually of the Wimbledon tennis tournament, if anything. The green and purple is their colour as well, but I'll stop rambling about things that are unimportant like that, because we will be going through first and foremost the new faction we're going to be seeing on the field today, the Avari of TAUR-IM-DUINATH. Now the Avari, if you're going to make a comparison to a faction that's already in the game, you'd probably go with the Elves of Ossiriand, in the sense that it's a fellow elven faction. Both of them are more lightly armoured, skirmish-focused factions, but that is where the similarities kind of end, because the Avari, they achieve their skirmish prowess mainly actually through throwing projectiles and the like. So you actually do have to get a little bit closer for them to be really doing what they want to be doing, which is more dangerous, of course, especially when you're talking about a faction which doesn't pack on the armour, which is more lightly armoured, a little bit more designed for hit and run. They're a very damaging faction overall, even in melee. They're not necessarily, well, they don't necessarily have the highest amount of armour piercing in their roster, but they do have a fair amount of base damage in melee. They get their armour piercing mainly from those missiles I was talking about, but you do have to be careful. Very much a hit and run focused faction. You need to be trying to pull the enemy apart, pulling them out of position. Again, that hit and run style, because if you do get caught in an outright pit fight with the enemy, unless they are a fellow lightly armoured faction where your damage can help see you through, and there are elements to your army as well which are a little bit tankier, which we'll get onto in just a moment, but they are a little bit more limited in number. I'm sure you can see them already actually just in the centre of the army here. Unless you're up against one of those factions, I wouldn't really try it. As soon as you go up against one of the really heavy duty factions like Feanor or Angband or something like that, you're really going to be better off playing to the Avari strengths, which is going to be that hit and run style. They do have archers, however. They're not going to be completely defenceless in that regard. We have the Moss Stalkers of the Darkling Woods. In effect, they're going to struggle in a skirmish fight against the really heavy archers, as you might expect. They do a decent amount of damage for the tier of archer that they are. Again, that's kind of true for most units that the Avari can field. Slightly more bestial looking elves than all of their brethren, it must be said. Darkling Woods, maybe a little bit more of a... living there maybe incurs this sort of like slightly ashen coloured skin that a lot of the Avari seem to come with. But yeah, their job is going to be the basic archers of the Avari, and you can use them in the same way that you would use any other light archer. Just in behind we have what would be the most numerous, most common unit of line infantry that the Avari can field, the the Stone Hewers, I should say, of the Darkling Woods. Now, as you may notice, they wield an axe, which means they're going to be a little bit more focused around that base damage. They've got a decent charge on them as well, which is true of many of the Avari units. As you would expect from an ambush-focused faction, they want to be doing a lot of their damage quickly when their enemy is still caught off balance. Naturally, however, the benefits of being this kind of unit are also balanced out by the negatives of the fact that their armour values are not necessarily the highest, neither is their melee defence in comparison to a lot of their other elven brethren. so they aren't going to be the best in long-term engagements against heavier units than themselves. They're going to be pretty good against fellow lightly armoured units, like I said, for that base damage that they do have. But you really don't want to be getting involved in just that outright slugfest fight with a lot of the other factions that I've already mentioned. But still, if you do need a line infantry unit to fill that basic role for them, then that is the first port of call as well. This, however, is where the Avari will gain a lot of their solidity, a lot of their tankier units. It's going to be in their, what would be classed as monstrous infantry, I suppose, these sort of Entish units, rogue Ents. Thorned Ancients of TAUR-IM-DUINATH. God, the pronunciation on these is very difficult for a lot of these units, but yeah, the Thorned Ancients, so you might look at them as being trolls, but it's not quite that simple. They do have a lot of HP, I believe it's 8 on this particular unit, but they don't have the same damage values as trolls. They're a little bit more designed to be that tanky unit. They will charge into the enemy lines, they'll scatter them of course in the same way that trolls do, but then again they will also find themselves being completely surrounded as a result of that. But this is where the Avari get a lot of their solidity from, because again, they're going to be significantly harder to bring down than a lot of the more lightly armoured units that the Avari traffic in elsewhere. You can see over there there's some more Moss Stalkers putting out their stakes, but I'm really interested to see how they perform, because I'm curious to see how a unit which is essentially going to be filling a similar sort of presence on the field as the Trolls do, but not being damage focused, instead being a little bit more based around their survivability. I'm very curious to see how that will work, especially against a faction like the Easterlings across the way. This big boy, however, is going to be the centrepiece of many an Avari army, I'm sure, the grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth, because this is a living artillery piece. You could look at it very much as being an equivalent to the Cygor over in Total Warhammer. And again, I'm really interested to see how this works, because the main weakness behind most artillery pieces is going to be the fact that once you engage them in melee, they're pretty much useless, but that's obviously not going to be the case with the grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth, because he is an elephant class unit, a single entity unit, not too dissimilar to Sauron. And of course the Ents do have previous form for throwing boulders at long range when you watch the Two Towers. This is going to be an important unit as well, because just having this guy on the field, the damage that he can deal with his long-range artillery means that the enemy can't just sit back and refuse to advance into you. They need to do something. They either need to take a different route and attack someone else on the field, or they need to move towards you. And of course, if they move towards you, they're going to put themselves at risk of getting ambushed, which a lot of the ambush units are over there, which we can't see, but we'll get onto those as the battle goes along. The host of the Withered Ash is going to be the Avari's best bet, really, when it comes to trying to hold the line, because very few, well, relatively few factions in Silmarillion have got access to a good, solid phalanx unit, and that's exactly what these guys are. They're pretty expensive, but they fill a similar sort of role for the Avari as something like the Nobles of Balar do over for the Philathron. Albeit you do have to take into account the Avaris. They have less of that kind of focus overall, whereas the Philathron can field that more traditional upfront army. The Avari are not going to be able to do that as easily, so do bear that in mind, but a very good unit for holding the line if you do need to. And of course, as the battle goes along, as you do wear the enemy down, you will need to start to deliver the killing blow, and in the late game, phalanx units can be a really good way of doing that, so perhaps that can be the late game push that Avari need to get them over the edge. And then some more stone hewers. We will be talking about more of the units. You can see Rangers of the Hidden Path are over there. There's plenty of units that are hidden over there too, but we'll talk about those a little bit more as they appear during the battle itself. Either side of the two lighter elven factions in this battle, in the centre we have Valinor, played by J-Monster, so very much the powerhouse which is going to be holding this effort together. The Swan Guard of Alqualonde, the Alqualonde units in general, these Teleri, are going to be a little bit more perhaps in line with some of the other lightly armoured elves that we're going to be seeing on the field today, but even they are going to be a little bit more forthright than a lot of the units from the Avari are likely to be. Unit of basic spears that are going to be pretty good on the front line. Of course, Valinor are an incredibly expensive faction, so the Alqualonde units are somewhat of a necessity to bulk yourself out into having an actual properly sized army. Some Mariners of Alqualonde as well, just in case more javelins were needed on the Avari's part. We didn't actually see any of their javelins because they're all hidden, as you would expect from an ambush style faction. But the Mariners are also going to be over here, also going to be throwing their projectiles. So plenty of close range punch over here from the Avari, as well as the little bit of support they're going to be getting from Valinor. And the Shoal Hunters as well, another unit of slingers. The Avari do have this kind of unit as well, where it's very low in terms of the base damage of the missiles, only 2, 3 perhaps, one of the units of slingers has. However, it is also armour piercing damage, so not to be taken lightly. volley after volley is going to have a real impact over time. But only Teleri over here. I would assume that means that more of the heavy duty units are going to be over here. More Swan Guard, more Mariners and more Swan Guard, and then just in behind here I think this is where we're going to see the really elite core of Valinor. We've seen Valinor not actually win a single game on my channel so far, which is somewhat surprising, albeit in the last battle they really put up a tremendous fight before they eventually fell. But Hearthguard of Tyrion, only 63, but one feature behind Valinor's units outside of the Teleri is pretty much all of their units would class as bodyguard units in other factions. They're small in number, but their stats are sky high. Many of them have also got multiple HP, so they're going to need to rely on that quality as well, because obviously the downside to that is there's not very many of them. So you do need to be quite careful, especially in wider open maps like this. Hearthguard of Tyrion, and then over here we have the Grieving Sons as well, another unit of Teleri. And I think that's just about it outside of a few units of cavalry. We can see here the Knights of Tyrion, which is a unit of cavalry we haven't seen up till now, but this is perhaps a little bit more of a typical unit of melee cavalry. And then over here, plenty also of the Shoalrunners of Alqualonde, so maybe a little bit more Teleri focused of a build this, with a few units of the Noldor in there as well. Now we move on to Ossiriand. I mentioned how this is probably the best comparison for the Avari over on the other side. They, however, get their work done a little bit more at long range with their archers. They can't rely on monstrous units as much. They do have a single unit, as I'm sure you can see in the background, of an elephant class unit, but outside of that they don't have quite the same close range punch that the Avari do. But they are maybe a little bit more traditional in the way that most people expect an elven faction to be, with all of their archers. Spear Host of Galleon and Spearmen of Rathloriel forming up a pretty decent front line here. Maybe not the most heavily armoured nor the most damaging, but in terms of cost efficiency, that's a pretty good front line from Ossiriand if they intend to be a little bit more upfront with their tactics. Got some Kinsmen of Denethor in here as well, who look to have, this might be an armour upgrade on them. But you can see that they are maybe a bit more of a traditional heavy spear unit. In addition to the Mythern and Tol-Galen here, they really are the two heavy units that Ossiriand can field. And that's going to be pretty much it. I really like the spear model on the Kinsmen of Denethor as well, almost like a sickle on the end of a longer stick. A couple of units of Earthin End Tower, and again, maybe Ossiriand are going to be a little bit more forthright, a little bit less ambush focused, because a lot of these units are a little bit heavier, it's a little bit more of an upfront build. 2 units of Earthin End Tower, going to be pretty at home with skirmishing, depending on who they're going to be going up against, and the armour piercing that the two-handed axes offer them also makes them a really good unit in the late game, provided they don't get focused down. We of course have the Ents. Elephant class units like this are going to be a real terror on the field if you allow them to be. They are obviously a little bit scaled up in comparison to the version in Reforged, which makes them look more menacing, and I do approve. Plenty of living trees on the field today between Ossiriand and their Avari cousins. And there are going to be some hidden units back here as well. Not quite sure where they are, but again, in much the same way as the Avari, we will get onto them as soon as they appear. Now, to the red team. And Ossiriand may have chosen the wrong tactic by not going with a more hit-and-run style build, because they're going to be facing off against Finarfin today. And it is, I suppose, the purple/blue team on this occasion are going to be more the good guys, because most of the red team are going to be fairly evil, and even Finarfin, as it pertains to elves, are probably the most questionable in terms of their morality. But yeah, Marksmen of Nargothrond, when it comes to being a powerhouse outlasting the enemy, Finarfin are arguably the best faction in the game because of the tools they have available to them. Marksmen of Nargothrond are going to be really dangerous for a faction like Ossiriand to face off against, and they also have some Swordsmen of Talath-Dyrn over here as well, so if it does come down to a bit of back and forth with javelins, they are well prepared there, and the Swordsmen of Talath-Dyrn are a perfectly serviceable unit of line infantry as well, even without the javelins at their disposal, and some basic unit of archers of Talath-Dyrn as well, so plenty of range units to be getting on with, but that does mean that they'll have to have brought less infantry, albeit it does look as though they've gone quality heavy. Wardens of Nargothrond, a very strong armour-piercing spearman, of course. Many Finarfin armies. I haven't seen, in fact, Finarfin not bring the Wardens of Nargothrond in the past, either the full or the half-strength version, because they're just so reliable. The Arqueni Mormagilwa, a unit that, in terms of quality, wouldn't be out of place in Valinor, to be honest with you. A fantastic unit of heavy swordsmen, and again, the sort of thing which Ossiriand won't want to be dealing with in melee, because that base damage from them will cut through the more lightly armoured green elves. And there's also the Sartor Finderato as well, which are a much more defensive unit, but it makes, again, just adds to that solidity that Finarfin has. Plenty of quality. Is that 2 units of Sartor Finderato? No, I think they're just spread a little thin. And we also have the company of Prince Gwyndor, which are a unit of line infantry, which have something of a unique little feature, that they have a really long charge distance, which on occasion, if you're looking to catch out a unit of infantry, especially archers actually, which maybe don't move away from you quickly enough, it's the sort of thing which can lead you to catch them. Its usefulness is limited, admittedly, but it's a neat thing to see nonetheless. And as a line infantry unit, they're still pretty good. They beat the Swordsmen of Talathin in terms of quality. There's a few more of them as well, which is nice. And also a unit of, well, a catapult with the Wands of Nargothrond manning it. So plenty of ranged punch here from Finarfin. They've actually brought enough archers to the point where they will beat Ossiriand at range, which is somewhat interesting. We'll have to wait and see how Ossiriand and their allies decide to respond to that. Then we have Wallywolf playing as the Dominion of Toll-in-Galadhon. Some Hishtbukraz Zagulaklab, so the Javelin Wargs, going to be moving to the aid of Finarfin by the looks of things. Going to be a little bit difficult as well for the melee cavalry from Valinor to be able to... Oh, excuse me. Almost choked then, for no apparent reason. But it's going to be quite difficult for the melee cavalry of Valinor to have free roam of the field, but they're going to be able to use their horse archers before then. Scarahai Longfangs also as well, another unit of throwing projectiles. Looks like the Dominion have gone numbers heavy, which isn't too much of a surprise when you consider what they're all about. Hishbuk-Krau's Hunters. Over here we have the Gijak Skaraz Chosen. I believe this is an armour upgrade that they have available to them, which makes them a little bit more solid. They look pretty heavily rusted, but even so, makes them just a little bit more solid on the front line. And if you're going to do that, the Gijak Skaraz units are really the only ones you can rely upon to do that. They may have had a complete unit model change though as well. I'm fully willing to admit that I may have missed that. A couple of units of Wolfguard as well, a unit of Mace Men. If you are going to play more up front or up close and personal with Toll-in-Galadhon, you need that Gijak Skaraz to offer you the same solidity. It's the closest they come really to emulating their allies in Angband. And then we have the Thrang Sheik Wolfborn and the Gijak Skaraz Zagula Glab as well. So yeah, it must be just a standard model for them now. Unit of melee wargs, and of course the strongest unit of cavalry that Toll-in-Galadhon have in the Thrang Sheik. Very good battlefield presence from them. Some Hishbuk-Kraz Howlers, really difficult unit of trash to get your way through, because they will just stand and fight to the bitter end. They're really annoying unit, honestly, to have to try and cut your way through, because what you want from your trash units is to be that tar pit that is just stands its ground, fights, and does as much damage as possible, while your true heavy hitters do their business. And the Hishbuk-Kraz Howlers do a pretty good job of doing that. They are weak to arrow fire though, there's no doubting that. A couple of units of Scarahai Trappers, more javelins and throwing projectiles in general. Javelins obviously a very big part of how Silmarillion works, and also some Scarahai Blood Drinkers. That armour piercing going to be more at home dealing with Valinor. But now we move on to the final faction on the field today, which is going to be the Easterlings, commanded by Tundra's Fox. Interestingly enough, archers are one way that you can make the Avari's life difficult, and the Easterlings themselves only have one unit of foot archers, that being the Fangs of the Faithless, so they may well end up being a very important part of how the Easterlings want to do their business today. We'll wait and see how effective they can be. Clan Guard of Lothlin, one thing that the Eastlings will have at their disposal in this fight is going to be the melee advantage if it comes down to just a straight up brawl, for the same reasons I mentioned earlier when talking about the Avari. The Eastlings simply have more options when it comes to heavier units, and stuff like the Clan Guard of Lothlin, a lot of the high base damage of the Avari is going to be reduced by the armour that they wear. And just in general, the Eastlings have got a few more options when it comes to really high end stuff as well in melee, like the Amborone Honour Guard. The equivalent units from the Avari do not have the second hit point that the Easterling versions do, or this version does. Also, the Halberdiers having access to a phalanx unit of their own means that the Withered Ash Spears are not going to be quite such a match winner in the late game if both sides can maintain these phalanx units for later on. Ravagers of Himring, when you're going up against a lightly armoured faction, these Falxes can also be very, very handy, but they're also very, very fragile, and this is the sort of thing which the Avari can take full advantage of as the Eastlings potentially advance into their territory. The Sons of Ulfang are dangerous, armour piercing, which won't be as useful against the Avari, but just in general they are one of the scariest units of infantry that the Eastlings can field, but again fragile because they're a bodyguard unit that doesn't have that second hit point. And some Despoilers of Dor-Caranthir as well, so plenty of the Easterling Falxmen. If they can get into melee and tie down a lot of the Avari units, they could be in trouble, but it's a high risk strategy this, because if the Avari can start nailing them with all those javelins, they're going to do a lot of damage to them very, very quickly. But yeah, considering this is a field battle, I think we can get going pretty much immediately. So without further ado, let's begin. So it would be over on this side of the field, I think, where we're going to start to see the first of the action, purely because Ossiriand and Finarfin are closest to one another, and Finarfin in particular is going to have the ability here, I think, to pull Ossiriand around a little bit, which is something of a rarity. The artillery is going to be the first means by which they do this. If I were Ossiriand, I probably wouldn't actually march towards the forces of Finarfin here, because you're just going to end up outnumbered in terms of the archers that you have. Individually, yes, the Earthen Tower will be the superior option here, I think. Or even then, I'm not sure, in a straight-up skirmish fight, and then they fall away. Some scouts of Galleon do reveal themselves, which will help out, but there's not too many of them there. This, the Ondo Hyando and San Athrad, are an armor-piercing archer that will definitely be useful against the heavier units that Finarfin have to offer. Any reinforcements that come from Toll-in-Galadhon and their Giga-Skaraz units would also be in a little bit of trouble there. You can see the Hishtbuk-Kraz already coming over. This is going to make advancing towards Finarfin a bit of an impossibility, to be honest with you. Now they've got all of this mounted support as well as having a lot of punch and power at range. It does look as though all of the mounted units for Toll-in-Galadhon are on the way over. The main body of their army still yet to make up its mind completely. The basic Hishtbuk-Kraz units appear to be making their way over. The Easterling army is also scurrying across here, not wanting perhaps to advance into the inevitable ambush perhaps and artillery that the Avari have going on. Shoal Hunters are moving forward. I mean, some of the units should probably move around that way, which is what J-Monster is doing with his Alqualonde units, so that they have the potential to flank around. The Stone Hewers of Darkling Woods, we've already seen them, but we should be able to see actually now some of these units that were hidden previously. First and foremost, the Thorncasters, which are another kind of slinger type unit, in the sense they've got very low base damage, but they are armor piercing. I'm interested to see how they differ to the other slingers, because there are a few and we may be able to see them. Several Thorncasters actually. Looks like that's the entirety of the forces that were here. And are there other units that have revealed themselves as well? I'm sure there are. Stone Hewers, the host of the Withered Ash, Moss Stalkers. Yeah, we're not really seeing too much of anything else. Plenty of the regular units. Here are the Rangers of the Hidden Path, one of the Javelin units that the Avari will be reliant upon as well. I think there's 2 units of them, so I think that's an armor-piercing Javelin unit, which is very, very damaging, which is going to be a big part of how they're going to have to try and do things here. We do have some Croatani Huntsmen over here, a unit of basic Easterling Horse Archers who are going to be moving. What's going to be happening here then? The Grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth is moving forward, and he does have the opportunity here, perhaps, to utilise some of that artillery ammunition that we've seen in the past, but he is really quite horrendously isolated here. I don't quite know what he was thinking. I don't know if this was intentional or whether he just clicked onto one side of the map and then... Well, we are going to see the artillery. I think this effect is something that they are working on a little bit, but you can't have a throwing animation too easily in Medieval 2 without getting into the source files, which is something you can't really do on the Steam version of the game. You can on the non-Steam version, interestingly enough. Here you can see Croatani Huntsmen. They're actually Javelins, which is a real problem here for the Grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth, which is why I'm really surprised he got sent forward all on his lonesome. It doesn't matter how strong your individual unit is, if you're opening yourself up to this kind of punishment, you deserve everything you get. I mean, he's not going to die because he is so tanky, but that's a huge amount of damage he's already taken now. Mariners of Alqualonde will keep the Croatani Huntsmen at bay, but there isn't really a huge amount of quality over here. Most of it, in fact, is ranged units. Only the Swan Guard are a unit of straight-up infantry. Well, over on the other side, Finarfin are moving forward just a little bit, and this is maybe something they weren't hoping to encounter. It's a little bit more of a wide-open plain. They can kind of tell exactly what Valinor are going to be doing, and some of the Ossiriand units that are infantry-based are also near them now as well, but you always have to expect a little bit of a hidden presence from Ossiriand, so marching into an open plain like this, into enemy territory, is always going to be a little bit of a worry for you. Moss Stalkers are moving forward, maybe not the best in a skirmish fight against the likes of House Finarfin, but it just lets them know that they are going to get shot up if they do elect to move forwards. But it is over here where we're seeing more of the action so far. The Valinor's Teleri units and some of the Entish units from the Avari. The Thorncaster is going to be moving forwards and probably going to start to try and batter on the front of these Easterling units, but again, these are the Lothlin units, so if this comes down to a pure melee fight, you'd have to back the Easterlings here. They've certainly got some of their heftier units, whereas even the Valinor units over here are just the Teleri, but it's whether or not they can actually get into melee without getting shot up. And you can see here immediately they're taking a pretty decent amount of damage. Again, the base damage is low enough to the point where they're not going to get absolutely eviscerated in a single volley, but they're going to take several before they get into melee. The Amberone Honor Guard are also in there. And now they're just going to move backwards, and as they move backwards, the second layer of skirmishers, the Teleri Javelins, are also going to start doing their thing. Croatani Nomads, that's going to be the Horse Archer version, not the Javelin version as I saw previously. The Spoilers of Dor-Caranthia, but this really, I think, is just going to be a matter of efficiency for the blue team. I don't know if they're necessarily going to be able to... Pillagers of Himring are in the backfield as well. I don't know if they're necessarily going to be able to defeat an Easterling force of this strength. The Shoal Hunters are getting accosted in melee. The Thorncasters turning around and immediately spewing their thorns in the direction of this unit of pillagers. Looks like they're going to rout, and indeed they do. There are some Ossiriand cavalry units backing them up as well. Grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth. It does look as though at this point they're almost in full retreat. Host of the Withered Ash are here. That's something that can hold the line, but they don't have the ability to bottle the Easterlings up into that phalanx. They're just going to get surrounded and destroyed if that is how they want to go about things. One unit being left behind is a bit of a rearguard action over here of the Swan Guard of Alqualonde. Perfectly good as the tier of spearmen that they are, but they're not necessarily going to have the damage required to crack through the heavier Easterling armour, and more worrying for them perhaps is the damage that the Folksmen can do. The Spoilers of Dor-Caranthia, they're not charging in, but they will do damage here. Spoilers, Pillagers of Himring also moving around the edge here. That is the problem here for the blue team. They're trying to retreat, but with the cavalry nearby, including the mighty Threngsheik, who, if they get charges in, it's going to be all over for the units they charge into. I don't think they have to, I mean, they can try and get some spearmen in there. Thorncasters are there, Shoal Hunters and Mariners. They're not taking charges from the Threngsheik, but it's still a bit of a worry. We'll go down to half speed for the time being, because there's an awful lot happening on the field now. Croatani Nomad's not the most damaging unit of horse archers that there is, but they're still going to be making decent use of their ammunition here. And with 2 units of them, they'll be able to outlast the sentries of Gallion, who need to be very careful of the stakes that the Avari laid down in the early game. Host of the Withered Ash coming over here. This is going to be a nasty charge from the Threngsheik. As far as their ability to do damage off the charge, this is the scariest unit on the field today, and when the map is wide open like this, units are in full retreat trying to scurry for cover. That's where a unit like this can be so effective. That was the Grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth. Getting a good hit there into the Clan Guard of Lothlin. Several of them will get back up, so it's not like a catapult shot where hits are a guaranteed kill. But it does mean that even those units that you don't kill will get knocked over and they'll have to reset themselves. It's kind of similar in many ways, very similar to the equivalent unit from Nandan Gorthar. The Urush Abomination as it is, but I'm sure we'll see that at a later date. Moss Stalkers of the Darkling Woods starting to fire away. Not too surprising to see that they have poison ammunition. And they are going to be firing into their opposite numbers, which is going to be the Scouts of Toll-in-Galadhon. That's a bit of a strange choice for a skirmish fight. They're the lighter unit of Finarfin archers. I would have imagined that they would have gone for the heavier unit, but I suppose he wants to save his split shot projectiles for later on. You can see that they know there's a presence over here. Archers of Talaf-Dyrnin moving over to try and force the Shoal Runners into retreat, but there are also Ossiriand units that are hidden back there as well. I don't know whether he's aware of that or not. But so far, they're just laying the groundwork over here. It's over here, though, where I think the red team will be quite happy with how this has gone, because they are going to win this fight over here, ultimately, and that will allow the Eastlings to get in behind enemy lines. Whether it's come at too great a cost remains to be seen, and several of these units will be able to get away as well, let's not forget. Croatani Huntsmen using their javelins to good effect, throwing into the Thorncasters, getting through their oaken armour. They need to try and save as much as they can. I really don't think that foray achieved all that much for them, and part of the problem is the Easterlings could very quickly change their minds. They were sending a lot of their units around to help their allies on the other side, but then they doubled back when they saw, actually, if we send most of our strength this way, we're actually going to be victorious, whereas that wasn't a luxury the blue team had. Once they committed forwards, they were really far away from their reinforcements. And that has proven to be a bit of a problem. Mariners of Alqualonde still being harangued by the Thrangship Wolfborn. Still a few units over there, Rohirtani Nomads, Pillagers of Himring, the Easterling Cavalry, giving them the mobility as well. It's not as if they've come out of this completely unscathed, the Easterlings, but they've definitely come out a bit better than their opponents. And map control is now greater for the red team. And the Despoilers of Dor-Caranthia, who very often we've seen the Easterling Falksmen be relatively easily targeted down. That hasn't been the case this time though. They've been able to get into melee and really show what they're all about, carving their way through these lighter Valinor troops. And that is going to be a rout for them. As we'll go up to 1 speed now as well, now that things are a little bit easier to keep track of. It is... what's going on there? Shoal Hunters of Alqualonde getting a flanking shot into the Ravagers of Himring. Trying to do the business against the Thorncasters. Sentries of Galleon trying to give them a little bit of cover as well. Clanguard of Lothlan, how many of these Thorncasters are going to be able to get away? They need to set up a secondary front line over here, which is what's happening now. Avari sending over some Moss-Stalkers. Ossiriand are also going to start firing in. So the Eastlings do need to be a little bit careful, and that's exactly what Tundra's Fox is doing. He sees that as he gets closer to this situation, he's going to want to not charge in with his Falksmen so eagerly, because the Ossiriand archers and the Avari archers will do the business against him. In come the Thorned Ancients. This maybe isn't the best fight to see what they're all about. I'm really curious to see what this more effectively defensive troll unit is going to be able to do. But really they're just sort of helping to force back the Falksmen onto the defensive. The Thrangsheep Wolf will need to be a bit careful. Again, being close to all of these Thorncasters, taking little bits of damage here and there. Individual riders starting to fall away with a bit more density now. Sentries of Galleon. So yeah, the Eastlings, I think now would be the time that they want to maybe slow up, adopt a bit of a slower approach, and wait for their allies to start making some gains as well. Because if they continue to fight forward, eventually they'll run out of steam and be destroyed when the Avari gain the assistance of their allies. And you can see already a good amount of damage is being done. Swanguard of Alqualonde are routing by all of the Thorncasters. The Rohirtani Huntsmen continuing to do their thing with their javelins as the Thorned Ancients scurry away. What's going on over here? We are starting to see some scouts of Galleon fire into these positions over here. Marksmen of Nargothrond still moving forward up front. The Shoal Runners of Alqualonde also in range. So the time is coming for Finarfin to have to commit to some sort of strategy here. I say that's a little bit harsh. Like they're already going for the slower approach, trying to move forward methodically, and then utilise their skirmishers, their heavier skirmishers, to maybe force the enemy onto the defensive. But they're not really being able to gain any sort of, or get a grip on any sort of damage on the enemy armies at this stage, because they haven't really allowed them to. Meanwhile, the split shots hitting the scouts of Galleon, that will be easy kills really for the marksmen, but it won't be on maybe the kind of unit that they want it to be on. Forward comes some scouts of Toll-in-Galadhon. I think still up here, yes, the Toll-in-Galadhon infantry, or a large portion of it, is now going to start moving down the central lane, which is very narrow, but seeing as the red team have effectively taken up the mantle of being the attackers now, they've seized the initiative in this battle so far with their victories over on this side, and they've got map control now. It's on them to now try and pressurise every attacking lane they possibly can. This is the problem with the lack of Easterling foot archers though. Now they are in range and the Moss-Stalkers are starting to do a decent amount of damage. On the right kinds of units I'm not so sure. Ravagers of Himring, yes, but a depleted unit of Clanguard, probably not. And in come the Entish units here. They almost look like they're running on their tippy toes, the Thorned Ancients. They're moving in. A single unit of Clanguard, more of a defensive unit of line infantry, maybe aren't going to be able to cut through the vast amount of hit points that a unit like this has. Might not be killed off quite so quickly by the Thorned Ancients as you might expect. The Fangs of the Faithless getting in position to try and do a bit of skirmishing with the Avari. But this is the thing, that's why I would say the Eastlings should stay out of range for the time being of this position until their allies are ready to fully commit forward. All of the gains they have made may be for nothing if the red team does not coordinate a little bit better than this. It's going to be easy for the blue team to coordinate now because all of their armies are effectively back to back, very close to one another, so they can move as one much more easily, whereas the red team are going to need to try and move as a slightly more cohesive unit across a wider area. Hishbukraz Zagulaklar doing a good amount of damage to the Shoal Runners as they're forced onto the defensive. They've got better range, of course, but the Hishbukraz are far cheaper and they don't really mind being used as something to just push the Horse Archers back away from the main army. Still this unit of Scouts of Gallian skirmishing effectively on their own with the Finarfin archers. Surely the archers of Talath-Dianim will be enough at this point to overcome the foe that is in front of them. The company of Prince Gwyndor are there as well. As soon as Toll-in-Galadhon make their way through this central reservation here and start attacking from here, that's when Finarfin should move forward as well, because already the Easterlings moving back just a little bit more. It's alright to have the Fangs of the Faithless still in harm's way, I think, because this is really what they're all about. This is their entire purpose within the Easterling army. Ravagers of Himring are also over there. Thrangshik Wolfborn coming over in support. Interesting little counter-attack this. The Avari perhaps fancying their chances against their now depleted Easterling army. Clanguard of Lothlin having to go up against the Stonehewers of the Darkling Woods. Now, this is the kind of fight the Stonehewers actually wouldn't like if both units were at full strength, because that armour from the Clanguard would be enough to mitigate a decent amount of the damage, and the Stonehewers' lower defence would also not stand in good stead even against a more defensive unit of line infantry like this. Halberdiers are coming forward to back them up. In come the Thorned Ancients, the Thorn Casters perhaps out of ammunition, all of these Entish units. Tough, very tough to wear down. As I've said, all of the fragility of the standard Elven units that the Avari have is made up for by the Ents. You can see already they're maybe preventing the Eastlings from reinforcing that section of the line, but Despoilers of Dor-Caranthia are still here in high numbers, exactly the kind of unit that the Avari don't want to be dealing with in pure melee. The host of the Withered Ash, the grandfather to Deepwood Hearth, is going to get in behind enemy lines. He can start maybe shooting up these positions if he still has ammunition. If he doesn't, then he can still be used in the same way that we've seen Sauron used in the past, as a bit of a bludgeon, just running through the lines and keeping them off balance. The host of the Withered Ash, though, are going to be able to help counteract the fact that the Eastlings also have a Phalanx unit over here now to help anchor this line in place. And that is a point-blank shot there. Yeah, the Eastlings not liking this fight at all. They're going to need to get all of these Falksmen into melee. They're going to need to try and maybe intercept that living artillery piece as well. Thorned Ancients of TAUR-IM-DUINATH. Still some Thorncaster missiles coming in. Sons of Ulfang are here, and with their armour piercing, actually, they are by far the best Easterling unit for taking on the Thorned Ancients. You can see they're falling now at a rate of knots, so that really does go to show the value of a unit of high-tier armour piercing infantry like this. But in turn, they are taking an awful lot of damage from the skirmishers that are in behind, but this is really the first full-blooded engagement we've seen in this battle so far, and it's interesting that it's the Avari that have been the aggressor in that one. They decided that now was the time. In come some more Thorned Ancients, but they're going into Honour Guard and Halberdiers. Don't know how effective that will necessarily be. What remains of the Thrangshik trying to go after the grandfather. Now, yes, we are going to start to see Toll-in-Galadhon get into a bit of a melee fight as well, so this is where the fight is going to kick into high gear. You would imagine Hishbukraz Howlers intercepting these Moss Stalkers, so some of the Teleri from Valinor are going to have to intercept. They won't necessarily enjoy being in melee with the heavier Toll-in-Galadhon units, though. These Gijak Skaraz, it's going to be tough for the Teleri to do the kind of damage that they want to in melee. There's still the Ossiriand and Valinor infantry forces, which have yet to really be committed at all. The Swordsmen of Talath-Dianim forcing the Scouts of Gallian to retreat. So still, the blue team retreating further into their shape, but the time is coming whether that proved to be a good idea or not remains to be seen. But I would also say that I would be worried that the red team have not shown a little bit more urgency to get into a full-blooded attack with their Easterling allies over on this side already doing so. If the Easterlings win this side, regardless of that, then it doesn't really matter either way. But if they lose, and then some Avari reinforcements are forthcoming elsewhere, it might prove to be a little bit more of a problem. Overcome the Grieving Sons. What you would call maybe the most elite of all the basic Valinor Teleri units, a heavy swordsman as well, so they're going to be pretty decent against the more lightly armoured Easterling forces. They'll be able to go toe-to-toe with the Falksmen a little bit better than most of the Avari will. In come the Sentries of Gallion. There's also the Knights of Tyrion in here, so the Valinor cavalry coming over to try and give the Avari a helping hand, a little bit more heft behind what Valinor have. One of the lightest and one of the potentially heaviest factions in the game, depending on how you want to look at that. Again, the Grandfather shooting at the Clan Guard of Lothlin. It's going to come down to whether or not the Easterling Falksmen have got the damage to be able to kill off all of these units. I'm not sure. Only time will tell. Halberdiers of Lothlin a little bit exposed. Stonehewers struggling, as perhaps you would expect on this front line. Whether it's against the more heavily armoured Easterling infantry, where they can't do as much damage as they would like, or whether it's against the very damaging Easterling Falksmen, where they take a lot of damage. It's perhaps one of the most awkward infantry forces for something like the Stonehewers to actually face off against, now that I think about it. Meanwhile, Company of Prince Gwyndor, we can see their very long charge range. Finarfin Catapult, still a presence on this field. Something worth bearing in mind. Getting into the Swan Guard of Alcolonde, already struggling under the weight of all of those Gijax Scaraz units that are on the way forward. Earthen Tower now getting into melee. That armour piercing will be priceless against those Toll-in-Galadhon Orcs. And against the Company of Prince Gwyndor, to be fair, more of a medium unit, but still. This maybe is not the kind of fight the Scarahai Blooddrinkers would want. They would have been wanting to get into some of the more heavily armoured units of Valinor. They would have lost, but their armour piercing still would have been more useful there. Instead, they're being bogged down in all of these light and medium units of Teleri and Green Elves. And as a result, I would imagine that their low melee defense and armour is going to finish them off. Spear Host of Gallion, but there's a lot of range support here, which potentially can do an awful lot of damage. The Ondo Hyando in the background there revealing themselves. Mythern and Tol-Galen, Syrian, are they going to advance forward into this Finarfin line? I'm not sure whether that's going to go all that well for them. Forward go the Swordsman, charging into the Kinsman of Denethor. Two-handed Spearman backing them up as well. I mean, alone the Swordsman of Talau-Dinin won't win this fight. And there goes the Grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth, brought down finally by a cluster of halberdiers. Interested to see what the Avari's morale is like. I would imagine it's, again, the Green Elves may be the best comparison there. Swordsman of Talau-Dinin moving in now. Hishbut Kraz Zagula Club going after a unit of Earthen Tower, which is hideously exposed. Trying to flank around, but in the end this is going to be ruthlessly punished by all of the skirmishers that are here, and they're not going to allow these axemen to get really any sort of true damage off. At least you wouldn't have expected so. They are actually going to land a charge, which is more perhaps than they deserved. But it is looking like, in spite of losing their general over here, the Avari, the assistance that they got from Valinor I think has been enough. Bit of cavalry over here as well, the Outriders of Dweilwyn from Syrian. So yeah, it has been enough ultimately to win the blue team this flank. I mean, a highly Pyrrhic victory, you'd have to say. A huge amount of damage has been done. But the Hearthguard of Tyrion, the Sons of Ulfang taking a charge there from the Outriders. They need to be careful. Falksmen do have an anti-cavalry bonus as well. To be fair as well, I don't think there's actually that much of the Avari army left at this stage. Rangers of the Hidden Path. Most of what's left over here is actually Valinor units, so mutually assured destruction perhaps between the Easterlings and Avari. The Ents are moving in. Elephant class units. That is, I think, yeah, the Green Elf General. So 2 generals here for the blue team falling, which is a bad sign, you'd have to say. Scarahai Blooddrinkers, these Mythern and Tol-Galen. And that is where the Scarahai Blooddrinkers had armour piercing against the heaviest unit of infantry that the Green Elves have to offer. The armour piercing coming in handy. Slaying the general. Scarahai Trappers moving in support. Hishbut Kraz Howlers as well. It's actually turned into a single line battle now, seeing as how this central position over here has sort of merged with the main army anyway. Stonehewers moving in. They'll be a little bit more at home. What is going on there? Hishbut Kraz Ash Priests using their Nafatoon-like projectiles, enough to break the Thorncasters and the Avari in general. Their army in bits at this point. The Ondo Hyando, however, have seen the danger that these units represent, and actually it doesn't really matter what they hit out of these 3 units. They prefer to hit the Hishbut Kraz, but if they don't, they'll hit the Sartor Finderato or Arqueni Mormagilwa, so huge amount of quality that they could end up killing off here. There are the Gijax Scaraz chosen. Defeat seems certain for them, which is interesting. I can only assume that the qualities of some of these units now are starting to come forth. Rangers of the Hidden Path have already used their javelins. Unfortunately, we haven't didn't get a chance to see that, but they are now in melee, going toe-to-toe with the company of Prince Gwyndor. The Thorncasters did return from routing as well and have been recommitted to the front line. Rangers of the Hidden Path still there, actually wrapping around the front line to a certain extent. They need to push the Gijak Scaraz chosen a little bit closer in, I think. The Outriders of Dweilwyn getting some good charges into the back of some of these units as well, but Toll-in-Galadhon have got an opportunity here to overload the flank, and I think that's exactly what Finarfin wants to try and do as well. J-Monster recognises the danger and is going to commit a unit of Grieving Suns in there to help shore things up. Ishbrook Krauss Hunters are over there, still the mighty Ents, Elephant class units as I mentioned, so if you keep them moving they're really dangerous, but in order to get the most damage potential out of them you need to make it so they stand still and actually attack their foes. Forward come the Gijak Scaraz, however they are going to be punted into oblivion by the Ents. Swordsman of Talath-Din and routing from the Green Elves though. Like, this really isn't the kind of fight that traditionally they do all that well in, especially in comparison to Finarfin, and there's a lot of Wardens of Nargothrond here. There's a corpse in midair, foul sorcery. Knights of Tyrion, 2 units of them roaming around the backfield. If any of the parts of the line do start to break, they can charge in and temporarily stop the rot. This is a lot of quality over here in the middle though. The Knights of Tyrion and the Maithern and Tol-Galen. The Gijak Scaraz tried to get a charge off into them, but with the Ents on the way over here as well, this is where the red team are going to start to struggle a little bit here in the middle. Gijak Scaraz, Wolfguard, another armour piercing unit, which is being... I mean, it'll be somewhat effective against a unit like the Kinsmen of Denethor. So, could certainly stand to be worse. Meanwhile, Sartor Finderato being committed forward now. Finarfin's caution in the early stage of the game may pay dividends now with some really high tier units that they can commit forward. Mosstalkers of Darkling Woods, Avari archers being sent into melee and javelin men to try and halt the progression of the red team. The Gijak Scaraz chosen, not going to fall easily to out of ammunition skirmishers though. Oof. And a withering arrow storm there of split shot projectiles, although to be fair the Tyrion units are not going to be all that worried about that in comparison to other units. Outriders of Dweilwyn of Safi still moving around the backfields, as are the Shoal Runners, so in terms of cavalry advantage it now firmly belongs to the blue team, and they're going to need it because they're going to need to try and shut down a lot of these units which are causing them a problem. Marksmen of Nargothrond taking damage. Catapult crews moving back. They are Wardens of Nargothrond, so they are spearmen in melee, armour piercing spears at that, so the Knights of Tyrion do need to get out of here because that's one unit that they will absolutely fear, and rightly so. Meanwhile, more Hearthguard of Tyrion getting into the Scarahai Longfangs with the assistance of the Ents. The Ents so far have been real monsters on this front line. They haven't been brought down at all, and they have been really doing a heavy amount of damage to the blue team's armies. Finarfin still have a lot of strength over here, and again a lot of Wardens of Nargothrond, a really dependable unit in the late game. Cavalry is not going to easily be able to bring them down, and they are effective in melee. Still over here as well. In the middle the blue team have won, but on the 2 flanks they have both lost and are losing. There goes, that looks like, yes, the Toll-in-Galadhon general. Probably the most useful general to kill because you're more likely to cause a panic in the ranks of the Orcs than you are of the other 2 factions on the field today. The Ondo Hyando now out of ammunition. The Ash Priests may have lost their general, but they're still pretty healthy actually, and they'll rip the Ondo Hyando limb from limb. Not really designed for melee combat against anything other than light units with their dual axes. The Ash Priests won't want them to get away. The Catapult crew chasing away the Outriders of Dweilwyn. Halberdiers of Lothland coming forward. Thorncasters now routing again. I don't know whether they'll come back another time. The Easterling general, we just saw him get flattened. Not too much of a concern anyway, though. The Halberdiers getting attacked by... Damn, there goes the Valinor general. So at this point, all of the blue team's generals are gone. The only faction that still has their general left alive is Finarfin. As I was saying, the loss of the Easterling general is not really too much of a concern because there's so few Easterling units left on the field that a rout will not be decisive at this point. The same could be said for the Avari. both those two factions tearing chunks out of one another in the earlier section of the field. Shoal runners, still the Ents roaming around. Is this mobility going to be enough to give them the win here, the blue team, purple team? They've still got a really healthy amount of these Hearthguard of Tyrian units. They're so difficult to kill. Valinor's quality may yet be enough to see them over the line. Some armour piercing on Gijak Scaraz's Wolfguard, but they're so depleted that I can't imagine that's going to be enough. Sartor-Findorata. I mean, the Scarahai Longfangs are going to get butchered in melee. The Sartor are going to come over here to try and help bring down the Ents. They're bloodied at this point. Marksman Nargothrond still shooting. Still a lot of green elves in here as well. Once again, the Thorncasters come back from routing and get into melee. They're very difficult to kill off in melee, you're noticing as well. They've just been hanging around here against those more defensive Gijak Scaraz spears. They haven't really, they've been routing, but they haven't really been dying. And that is going to be it for the Avari, the first faction to be completely destroyed, I think. I don't know if there's still some Easterlings left on the field. Either way, the Easterlings and the Avari are the first to go. Toll-in-Galadhon still got some heavy units available to them. Hearthguard of Tyrian are here. Outriders of Dwylwen still making a nuisance of themselves. Ondo Hyando are routing. Wards of Nargothrond at this point with their numbers looking like they're going to overpower the Hearthguard of Tyrian, and they're shaken actually. Goes to show, unless you have locked morale, anyone, truly anyone can rout, even some of the mightier units in Valinor. The Ents are starting to be laid low a little bit now. Sartor-Findorata are having something of an impact. And I don't know whether the blue team are going to be able to carve their way through all that Finarfin and Toll-in-Galadhon have remaining to them. Looks like the forces of evil may very well win this. I mean, cavalry like this may be enough. Swordsman of Talath-Din and a few Wardens of Nargothrond in here as well. Ooh, from the Ents. Doing a hefty amount of damage there to those Gijak Scaraz. Still some company of Prince Gwyndor in here, only 11 of them, but considering they were committed relatively early, they've held up pretty well in a pretty violent fight. So over here, Knights of Tyrian, Marksman of Nargothrond, Sartor-Findorata, just trying to shield themselves against these cavalry raids that the blue team is still able to launch. Outriders of Dwylwen, going to be a little bit more dangerous off the charge than the sword cavalry of Valinor. It's come down to just this one engagement. I think at this point all of those units there are very depleted ones that are routing. Yeah, and I don't think they have enough left in the tank. I think this is going to be a red team victory, interestingly enough. Ent at this point, I should say. Marksman Nargothrond still back there getting harassed, but the cavalry that was doing so has now routed. Hearthguard of Tyrian, there's not enough of them. Mostly spearmen left from Toll-in-Galadhon and Finarfin, not too surprising. There goes an N. Plummeting to the floor, there's still some Arqueni. 11 of them. It's been a costly battle for all involved, a violent one to be sure. Knights of Tyrian are charging in. I think at this point it's just a case of you've just got to banzai charge and accept your fate, because with this amount of spears left alive, even a cavalry unit as tanky as that is not going to be able to cycle charge anything into oblivion. What's going on over here? There's still a couple of green elves over here. The Earthen Tower, the Marksman of Nargothrond completely ignoring them, and that will be to their detriment. More likely to get friendly fire here, actually, the Marksman of Nargothrond. Having a look around elsewhere. Hearthguard of Tyrian over here are still alive. 10 of them remain. Taking a little bit of damage there. They are going to charge in. Swords of gold and silver held aloft. It's mostly Finarfin left, just a couple of units of fairly battered Gijak Scaraz chosen are all that remains from Toll-in-Galadhon, but they did their job here, considering this was more of a brutal fight in the late game. I think Toll-in-Galadhon held up reasonably well, considering the pressure they were under and the quality they were up against. Another unit of Hearthguard of Tyrion, Sartor-Findarato in the vanguard. But yeah, constantly retreating it felt like in this battle, the blue team. The Avari and Ossiriand on the flanks, they weren't really able to put up a really solid wall of resistance, because that's not really the kind of factions that they are. And in the end they weren't able to make full use of their ambush style tactics either, I don't think. In the end, that momentum, they never really quite got it back. The Easterlings did fall, but it wasn't as if the Avari made a full recovery either. All they were really able to do was even the battle up again, the blue team. And Finarfin had too much left in the tank in the end. With the assistance of Toll-in-Galadhon, that has seen them over the line. So, Knights of Tyrion, are they just going to charge into the spears at this point? I would imagine so. Given that we are now in the final stage, it's going to try and get a few more kills before they fall away. They may be able to finish off this unit of marksmen of Nargothrond at least. Only one of them fell there. Charging through that unit instead. I'm sure J-Monster will realise the futility of this situation in a moment and charge in. Yeah, there we go. And now they will be brought down by a whole bunch of spearmen, and so the forces of evil and what we are dubbing as the fallen elves in this battle of Finarfin have been victorious. Valinor still yet to win a game on my channel, which is remarkable. I mean, they certainly more than pulled their weight in this fight. Got to see their strength here very, very clearly. Again, it's the numbers. The numbers were certainly in favour of the red team here, which is not too surprising considering there was an Orcish faction, much more numerous than any other army on the field. And even then, the second most numerous army was the Easterlings. Interesting to see Valinor then bring up. It was more of a Teleri-focused army rather than an elite-focused army, which, considering how wide the battlefield was, I think that was actually a good idea. But in the end, the Alqualonde units on more than one occasion were also caught in fights they really weren't going to be that good in the early engagement against the Easterlings, which went against the blue team, you have to say, and the Easterlings took real advantage of that. And also, just later on, I feel as though they could have done with a little bit more quality, but I feel like the army composition wasn't really the problem here. I feel like it was just the way that the battle panned out. Safi got the most kills of all the armies. The Green Elves, that's not too surprising from an army like theirs either, considering how much damage they can do at long range. Stuff like the Ents are also very damaging potentially. Interestingly enough though, I mean, their infantry, how much would their infantry have really done? Not sure. The Avari, the initial engagement on them was rough, but they recovered really well, and we did get to see what the Avari are all about ultimately in terms of what they were able to do, especially with the Entish units. I'd like to see a little bit more of their javelins in action. I'd also like to see how they get on against a faction whose infantry is not quite so universally awkward for them to fight as the Easterlings infantry actually is. Like I said, the heavier Lothlin units, they can't really do as much damage through that armour as they would like. And then also, subsequently, against the more lightly armoured but more damaging Folksmen, the Folkses are able to do so much damage to them in return that it's a little bit strange. Certainly not the sort of faction you want to be taking a straight up fight with, but that's true of most foes against the Avari. It's something that you commit your infantry late on with their high damage to finish a wounded foe off, rather than try and tackle them head on right from the start in a way that certain other factions can do, like Finarfin for example. Let's see what did the damage for Valinor though. The Grieving Sons did very well, not too surprising I don't think, considering they were very effective against the Easterlings, and then they were also sent in as a bit of a last-ditch effort to hold on to that flank. It was unsuccessful, but they were still getting kills all the while. The mounted Knights of Tyrion as well, doing a very good job. 287 kills on a unit of what is ultimately melee cavalry is an impressive number, nearly getting 200 kills on a unit of Mariners of Alqualonde as well. You can see, however, some of these Alqualonde units were the ones that fell afoul of that Easterling attack. Yeah, still the most decisive moment in the battle for me early on. It certainly set the scene. 116 on the Swan Guard, so individually not as much kills as maybe you would expect. I mean, the Hearthguard of Tyrion did decently, considering once they were committed, it was really a fight of just a really brutal fight as well. And they were committed against stuff that was pretty scary, stuff like Wardens of Nargothrond. You know, it is what it is. Not much more could have been done after the initial fights went the way that it did. And I think as well the red team do deserve a lot of credit for keeping the pressure up. I was fearing for them a little bit when the Easterlings attacked a little bit before their allies were in position, or at least before their allies were willing to push forward, because that could have gone so wrong. You know, we've seen several times in the past teams that do not act as one cohesive unit can end up, you know, losing or throwing away a lead, which could have been the case here, but it wasn't. And they were able to attack at just the right time. And that's really the takeaway I'd say from this, that, you know, surrendering that map control in the end for the blue team, you know, continuing to move backwards and continuing to be pushed backwards as well. It wasn't as if it was always by their choice. We saw one of the best visualizations of that was when those shoal runners of Alqualonde were getting pushed back by the Hishbrook crowds who were trying to get into, you know, the open field and start being an annoyance to the enemy team, but they weren't allowed to by the Toll-in-Galadhon wargs. And that was really a problem. Once you end up bottled up, especially as factions like the Avari and Ossiriand, because of your more lightweight nature, once you're bottled up, it can be pretty rough for you. And even Valinor on this occasion were more of a lightweight faction than they would often be because of their focus around their Teleri units. So that is worth bearing in mind. But good to see a new faction in action today in the Avari. I do have another replay as well in Silmarillion that's going to be coming up relatively soon, albeit that one is just going to be on the new patch. It doesn't actually include either of the two new factions. That's going to be more of a general update video, but it is going to be another large-scale battle, and we'll get to see a few more of the other factions that have had some updates done to them, as well as a couple that we already saw today as well. But yeah, we'll be able to see the likes of Gondolin and Doriath in that one, which will probably be coming up in the next few weeks, in addition to the 3-battle episodic series over in Reforged, and of course, towards the end of the month, we will be starting our explorations into Rise of Mordor with some top 10s/5s, and maybe some faction overviews as we move into December. That is the plan as it stands. If we do get another replay though in Silmarillion that includes Nandan Gorthab, I will push that towards the front of the queue again, because I'd like to see what they're all about as well. That's the other new faction that we haven't seen yet, another evil faction, more focused around monstrous units and spiders and the like, so good to see them make a return as well. But yeah, big thank you to all of the players involved today. I got sent this battle twice actually, both by Lord of Balagost and by J-Monster, so big thank you to both of them. Big thank you to the players, big thank you to the developers as well for continuing to put in the effort into Silmarillion, because it's certainly really coming to fruition now with all new content. It continues to get better and better as we move through, and hopefully I'll be able to show off more of it as we move into the final phases of the year. So yeah, I think that's pretty much everything. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.